Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LTA North week number 7 overview and analysis video. It's the final week of the quote-unquote regular season here in the LTA. I say quote-unquote regular season because it really is already over. The group stage has been determined. We've gone through every major kind of qualification series that we need. At this point, it's all just about the playoffs, and that's really this kind of a play-in week more so than it is like a regular season week. Of course, we've got matchups to determine the seeding in the upper bracket, and our final 2 teams to make the playoffs will be determined this week as well, which means our first 2 teams to be eliminated from the spring split will also be determined. A lot to go over in today's video. I hope you're excited. I know I am. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. Did the results surprise you at all this week? Were you shocked by any team over or underperforming your expectations? Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there, but let's go ahead and get into the content. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and because it is technically still a regular season here, we are going to give a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow at the end of the video. No power rankings to update, only a bracket to preview, so I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. We'll be kind of talking about where I think all of these teams are going to land, especially considering how they look in some pretty pivotal series to kind of show where they're at level-wise. We haven't gotten a lot of matchups between teams that are close in skill level because of just the way that this format is structured, so it's nice to see that we're finally going to get some answers here, but that definitely starts with our first series of the week here, our first series of day number 1, probably the one most people were most looking forward to across this week. A battle for the number 1 seed. It was Cloud9 taking on FlyQuest, and Fly obliterates them. This was not close. It was honestly completely disgusting to watch. 4 kills across both games combined for Cloud9. This was a massacre in favor of FlyQuest. It just was awesome to watch for them, and trust me, like, I'm not surprised by this. I know a lot of people were kind of looking at Cloud9 as a big favorite because they beat FlyQuest in the like the round robin stage, the beginning, the placement stage, if you want to call that, of the regular season, but Fly has always been number 1 in my power rankings for me ever since Team Liquid started playing inconsistent, and even with that loss, I still believed that FlyQuest was the team to beat in North America, and that has proven to be unbelievably true as they grab the number 1 seed with this series victory. Honestly, there's really not a lot to talk about. There's not a lot to analyze in terms of where these teams went, in terms of how they ended up playing, because it really was that dominant for Fly. There are individual micro adjustments that I could point out that Fly made or that Cloud9 did not make that ended up really costing them throughout this series, but at the end of the day, when you're 10k gold down at like 20 minutes into the game, it's basically impossible to win. Like, there's nothing you can do at that point, and it's losing everywhere on the map. You can't point one player out as being significantly worse than the rest, even though that is kind of the format, so I will try and do that. But for Fly, it's everything going right for this team. Player of the series for me is going to go to Inspired in the jungle, but I mean, come on, you can give it to basically anybody. I almost ended up giving it to Quad just because of that Silas play at the end of game number 2. That was probably the funniest and flashiest play of the entire series, stealing the Ornn ultimate and then just completely decimating the team. It was really funny, picking up a kill on that as well. And then Busio was also phenomenal in this series, and trust me, we're going to talk about that. There's going to be some award picks at the end of today's video, my All-Pro team and my MVP pick for just the regular season here in the spring split, and Busio will very much be in the conversation there, but Inspired to me was probably the main focal point for Fly in terms of just winning everywhere on the map, both on the Neferi, but specifically on the Pantheon in game number 2, where he really utilized that global ultimate in a really powerful way. We're seeing Pantheon pick up a lot of priority, specifically over in the East and specifically in the LPL. I'm surprised it hasn't made its way to the West more consistently than it has over the course of this year, but Inspired definitely really dominated on it and showed that if you do get ahead on that champion and if you get your laners ahead, it's impossible to stop the skirmishes, and everything does go incredibly wrong. But like I said, every single lane ended up dominating. Masu and Busio were incredibly far ahead. Busio was like 3 levels up on Vulcan at the end of game number 2, something absolutely ridiculous and something that should never happen to the support position. You have Whippo decimating Thanatos on the top side, playing more aggressive picks and being able to take advantage of Thanatos being placed on weak side for the most part. Like we already talked about, Quad was phenomenal, specifically in the team fights, but it's not like he also wasn't generating giant leads in the mid lane. It just was all bad for Cloud9 and all good for FlyQuest, and That's the encouraging sign. It's not necessarily that, oh, Fly just beat Cloud9. It's that this team, on their best day, when they are playing their version of League of Legends, they're the best team in North America by a large margin. The reason that they failed in the winter split, in my opinion, is because they weren't living up to their own individual potential. If they are going to start clicking as a unit like they did last year, I still think this team can run away with the LTA and be by far the best team in it. They're going to have a chance to prove it because they are the #1 seed going into playoffs, which, because of the results of the group stage, have actually become pretty consequential, and I'm sure Fly are going to be happy to grab this. But for Cloud9 on the other side, it's an absolute disaster. Nothing else really to say other than, this didn't go particularly well for you. I think you can give dud of the series to almost anybody. There are individual plays that you can point out, skirmishes in the mid game that ended up going awry, bad laning moments, and just mental mistakes coming in from a couple of these players, but I feel like pointing any of the individual mistakes out is superfluous at this point, because it really was just a mistake across the board. Everything went wrong for Cloud9, and that's the reason they're in this position right now. Thanatos is going to get my dud of the series because, he was just not very good. He did nothing on the top side of the map, participated in 1 kill across this entire series. The most noteworthy thing that Ornn did in game 2 is give the ult over to Sylas. It's just absurd how bad Thanatos was, considering he's a player that needs to step up. But again, I'm not just blaming him. Everybody played bad here. Vulcan was 3 levels down on Busio and accomplished absolutely nothing on either the Alistar or the Milio. Loki played one of his worst series since coming over to North America. Blabber was completely jungle canyoned. I mean, he was not even in this series. And you can talk about the, questioning, you can question the decision-making of drafting Vi and Xin Zhao for a team that has clearly shown they want to play through tanks in the jungle. They want to enable their solo laners to be able to be more primary carries. That's where they found the most amount of success. But it's not like, Blabber's bad on Vi. Like, it's one of his better champions, at least across this year so far. Xin Zhao is obviously a very strong champ in the meta and is considered a counter to things like Pantheon, and so you're not shocked by the response here coming in from Cloud9. The problem is it all just fell apart. You almost lost game 2 down 20,000 gold. We were staring down the barrel of a 20k gold deficit, which is just unacceptable. That's losing everywhere. That's not just one small mistake or 2 small mistakes that end up snowballing the game. No, that's everything going wrong for Cloud9. They're going to have to be better than this in the playoffs. I imagine they will be, but this is a ginormous win for Fly that really establishes them as the team to beat in North America, and it kind of makes it not particularly close. I'm kind of getting closer to the opinion that as long as Fly live up to their potential, there might not be a single team in the entire region, maybe outside of Team Liquid at their best, that can even really challenge them. They definitely are the best team right now in North America and the big favorites to win it all. Then moving on to our second series here, and this is our first elimination series of the week. The winner of this will make playoffs. The loser is done for the split. That's how much this best of 3 matters for these 2 teams. It was LYON taking on Dignitas. And Dignitas is going to pull off the upset in what I would consider an upset. A lot of people would consider an upset and pick up the victory. And I would say that it's like a big surprise and nobody really saw this coming. But honestly, if you had looked at the tape throughout more than just the spring split, I think this makes a lot of sense. Like, LYON was a bottom 1, bottom 2 team for me in the winter split. Obviously very small sample size, not really a lot to showcase. But outside of Saint really being able to dominate some of the lower tier mid laners, they don't have a ton going for them in terms of their positivity. Like, Henna's a pretty stable AD carry, but I wouldn't say that he's phenomenal. He makes a couple of mistakes per game, but for the most part, he's just going to be really consistent about the way he plays, and I have major question marks about Licorice, Odilan, and Lions in terms of how they've played across this year, and, even with Odilan stepping up and Licorice having a couple of better games, I would say, across this spring split, it's not like this team was perfect. I don't think this loss should be considered as big of an upset as maybe it's being made out to be right now, especially because Dig, at points this year, have actually shown a lot of upside as a team, and they finally got to unlock it here. And quite frankly, it's through the player that has quickly become easily their best player, and that is Shaden in the jungle, who's going to get player of the series. Obviously, a lot of talk about Shaden as a player right now because of the interview that he had last week, and just the narrative kind of surrounding him as a player. But on the Rift, outside of the, toxic behavior that he's shown in solo queue in the past, he is a phenomenally consistent player right now, and he has really stepped up and been that guy for Dignitas. When you look at where a lot of things ended up going right for Dig throughout a lot of the, wins in this series, game number 1 being able to come from behind with some phenomenal engages in the back half of the game, Surdy doing a great job to survive what was a pretty big early game deficit to allow players like Shaden to step up and, create for the team. But then you look at game number number 3, and that Olaf was genuinely unstoppable. Of course, a couple of things that went wrong for LYON. They ended up throwing the game in a couple of, key avenues, but Shaden was kind of the facilitator for everything that went right for the team, and you just got to give him a lot of credit for it. I think he's been very good across this year so far. When he came in for Dig in the winter split, replacing Lyra, when he actually, kind of got his visa and was able to get in the States, he was a huge upgrade. That team instantly got better when Shaden came in, and he's also been the best player so far in the spring split. So I feel pretty good about Shaden. That promotion has very much ended up working out for Dignitas, but it wasn't just him. The bot lane was really good in this series, and I don't know if they're going to get the credit they deserve for it. Tomo in particular was awesome in game number 3 on the Misfortune, was doing a ton of damage super consistently on that champion. Isles with one of the biggest plays for Dignitas' entire season, making sure that the Baron ends up resetting. Licorice making some gigantic mistakes on the Renekton down the stretch there, which we will definitely talk about, but Isles kind of being the one to capitalize that. Surdy being super consistent on the top side. We talk about the Jax game, and I think that was definitely more of a standout one for me, but the Cassante was also pretty relevant in the back half, and Kana made some big plays in terms of the engages he went for, again, even if he was down in gold for parts of this game. So credit to Dig. It felt like across the board, they made a lot of big moves in order to get themselves here, and because of this win, they're in playoffs. It did not matter that they were, not particularly good before this. It's a win and get in type of format, and that means that LYON is now eliminated. Their split is over, and it's a couple of different reasons. I've been a lot lower on LYON across this year. I've been a lot more pessimistic about their outlook, and I think a lot of their flaws ended up coming to fruition here, although I think there were a lot of positives as well. Licorice is going to get dud of the series. He just misplayed game number 3 so incredibly hard. There's really nothing else to say. The back half of that game could have been very winnable if it weren't for Licorice on the Renekton making a couple of mistakes. He stops hitting the Baron. Everything just kind of, goes against the plan. You see the Baron reset, and it's entirely his fault. And there's really nothing else to say there. He also played a couple of fights wrong. It's one of those massive mistakes that ends up really costing the team quite a bit, but you can also look in a couple of different avenues. I don't think Saint was really all that good in this series, and maybe that's just me being biased against Saint because I have been a lot lower on him than the average player or the average person has been watching, the LTA across this year, but Saint has been good against bad mid laners, and then when other teams step up, and specifically when he has to carry in the late game, he's just not been very consistent in that regard. I'm not on the Saint is a top 3 mid laner hype right now, and I think he was a part of the reason why they weren't able to overcome the hype. Henna was getting chunked out before every single fight at the beginning of this, and he was really bad on the Varus in game number 1 as well. ODLAN, Lions, I think they were generally fine. They've been, I don't want to say weak links. Lions has not been particularly good in the support position, and that's been a bit of a concern. ODLAN, I think, has stepped up, but even with all that, Shaden was definitely more relevant in the back half of the series. ODLAN was playing super safe for a lot of game number 3, and again, it ended up costing them because they were down in gold in a lot of those circumstances, and so LYON is going to feel really hard done by being one of the bottom 2 teams here in this split because, for the most part, they were a top 5 team in terms of production for a lot of this split, but that's what happens when you're not a particularly consistent team and you have a format that comes down to one best of 3 in order to qualify for playoffs. LYON just ended up with the short end of the stick in that regard, and Dig is going to be making it in. I wouldn't have been surprised by this at all at the beginning of the split. I had Dig ranked number 6 and I believe LYON number 8 going into the split in terms of my power rankings, but in terms of the form, it is a little bit surprising, but we can't underestimate this Dig team anymore. Shaden is actually really, really good if you're going to get players like Kana, Tomo, Isles, and even Surdy at times stepping up. That's going to be massive for them moving forward. But then moving on now to day number 2, the second half of the week here, and we go back to the seeding qualification series as we get a matchup for the number 3 seed as we get Team Liquid taking on Shopify Rebellion. And Team Liquid is going to pick up the pretty dominant 2-0. The story is not necessarily Team Liquid picking up the win here. I think we all kind of expected Team Liquid to be the better team by a pretty considerable margin, but the more interesting story is the change in the jungle. We knew this was coming, and it had been announced for a couple of weeks now. Yuji had been signed by Team Liquid, and in fact, this was probably in the works for quite a long time. Again, I'm not trying to peel the curtain back, but they knew they were bringing in Yuji for at least a couple of months at this point, and they just needed to get everything in order, and they do so, and get him his first series right before playoffs here, and it certainly makes things a lot more interesting because, I've talked pretty extensively on this channel about how I've been kind of an hater in the past, but this has probably been his best split ever, including his time in the LCK, just in terms of the production he's been on, so it's a pretty funny time for Yuji to come in. I think overall, this is probably going to be an upgrade. I think it's just unfortunate that was in such good form right as he was getting replaced, but for Shopify, they're just happy to be here, man. Like, this was a team that might not have made the playoffs if there hadn't been a gigantic upset for them over a 100 Thieves team that really could not afford to lose. Like, they really could not afford to be put in that position. Obviously, we'll talk about them in the second series here today, but Shopify, within the top 4, is just happy to be included along for the ride. This might be a team that ends up not winning a single playoff series. But at the end of the day, they're still in playoffs. It's just, maybe not the most competitive playoff team of all time. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series for me is going to go to the new blood in the jungle. It's going to go to UG. I think that there were a couple of great options here. I think APA's Nico ultimate in game number 2 was really influential. Obviously kind of learning from his mistakes against LNG at Worlds last year where he wasn't able to flash ult on the Nico. He ends up getting a huge one off at the end of game 2 that really sealed the deal for Team Liquid. I think Core JJ was super consistent throughout the entire series in terms of the setups, and LYON was great on the follow through, but Impact was also really good on the Rumble. He's a player that I've criticized immensely across this split and across this year for being genuinely one of the worst performing top laners in North America, full stop, regardless of if they're on a good team or a bad team. He's just not been good so far in 2025, but UG to me is the standout because I do think so much of the game ended up actually flowing through him, and they allowed him to play the stuff that he's really comfortable at playing, specifically the Viego in game number 2 that a lot of people know UG for, and he went up against Contracts, a player who is kind of like the barometer right now in the LTA in terms of can you make it as a jungler versus, are you not good enough to be a tier 1 jungler? Credit to all the people out there that talk about Contracts as an MVP candidate. I respect you guys and I understand where you're coming from. This is going to be my de facto answer as we talk about it throughout the series, but my criteria for value in terms of all pros and MVP is how many wins are you adding to your team? How many wins do I think your team gained because you were on them? And unfortunately, if your team is not winning, it's hard for you to add wins. Like, credit to Contracts, I think he's been good this year, but he's not a superstar in the jungle. He's just a good player at this level, and I think that gets exposed when he goes up against the best junglers where he's just not quite able to survive. I like Contracts as much as the next guy, but I do think it would be unbelievably ridiculous in my opinion to put him in the MVP conversation. Credit to all the people who have that opinion. I'm not trying to say that anybody's stupid for having it. There are stupid MVP opinions that I've seen. Contracts is not one of them. It's just by my criteria, it would be absurd for him to be in that conversation for me, and I think him getting completely outplayed by UG in this series is kind of an example of that. I think there are some explainable differences in terms of why things went the way they did. Obviously, the Kazakhs in game 2, but at the end of the day, UG was awesome, and he had about as ideal of a first series in as you could possibly have. But again, everybody else in this team was also phenomenal. APA with a great Flash Pop Blossom. That's kind of what people are going to remember, but he was super consistent throughout the series. I very much wanted to give him player of the series and just kind of went slightly away from it, but if you wanted to do that, I think that's totally fair. Impact definitely had his best game of the entire split in game number 1 when Fudge was on the Rise on the other side of that matchup. I understand why you might think Rise is a bit more of a flex pick and why you might think of it as a counter to Rumble on the top side. It did not end up working out in that regard. The bot lane was excellent. They have not been superstars over the course of this split, specifically LYON, I think has had more trouble taking over games in the same kind of way with the amount of resources being pumped into him, but they were also really good here. This was just a nice win for Team Liquid, and I know people are going to talk about Spawn coming back to the States, and I agree that is definitely a huge upgrade, and I'm sure it affects this team in a pretty massive way. Having him clearly makes them a much bigger threat, but at the end of the day, it's all really about whether or not they can execute on some of the plays they've been looking for. It's the minor differences that changes Team Liquid from a team that, gets to the late game neutral and gold and then, misses a flash ultimate and loses the game versus a Team Liquid that gets to the late game in neutral gold and hits a flash ultimate to win the game. Like, that really is kind of the marginal difference that this team has. So we'll talk about Shopify now. Already kind of went in on Contracts, but he's dud of the series for me. Got completely out-jungled by UG in terms of the pressure in the mid-game. Kazakhs is just not it right now. I really do not understand this pick. I don't think it's viable in any way. Maybe they were just testing it out. They realized that they probably had no shot in this series anyways, and they want to get as much information as they can before going into playoffs. Well, I think you learned that Kazakhs, even with something like Galio in the mid lane, is just not functional in the current meta. I just do not understand the pick. He got mega outplayed on it. Seos was also in consideration for me for dead of the series, but for the most part, the plays he was making were, expected. Like, you're supposed to die on Alistar and Nautilus, and he was going in first in a lot of these exchanges. Maybe he was a bit too far forward, and him and B-Void definitely lost in the 2v2, but that's more so expected, and honestly, I didn't see anything egregiously bad, more so than Contracts picking Kazakhs, and so that's what kind of tipped me over the edge. Palafox continues to not be very good for this team. I wouldn't be surprised to see him get replaced going into summer, but once again, I don't know how many teams in the NACL that would be, upgrades in the mid lane are willing to give up their mid laners. There are a ton of teams right now, like Dragonsteel, Dark Zero, like Near Airport, and like Luminosity, that would be upgrades, like mid lane wise. Like, obviously Spyrax or Toasty, Insanity, and Pobelter would all be great for Shopify, but how many of those teams feel like they cannot win the NACL, right? Like, those are players that are going to try to qualify up through the system, and so it's going to be difficult to be able to acquire them when they're already under contracts and under contract, not contracts, and that makes it difficult to acquire a mid laner domestically in the middle of the year. Obviously, it can happen. UG was acquired by Team Liquid, but, Dark Zero had a backup plan already. They had signed Shimmer at the beginning of the year, and a lot of these teams don't have backup options in the mid lane that can keep them as competitive. And so I don't think it's going to be quite as easy to upgrade from Palafox as everybody likes to make it out to be. I really don't think a lot of those NACL teams are going to be willing to give up their mid laners. But you also have a player like Fudge just kind of getting outplayed. The Rise did not work on the top side. B-Voy was pretty bad in this series. Everything is just kind of going wrong for Shopify, and everybody kind of saw this coming. This team is not relevant at a top 4 level. They're lucky to be here, and I think they're going to show that in the playoffs when they probably lose in round 1 and then lose in lower bracket round 1, if I had to guess. And then for Team Liquid on the other side, this team is pretty good, man. Like, it's a top 3 in the LTA right now between FlyQuest, Cloud9, and Team Liquid. If TL ends up coming out on top again, just like they did in the playoffs in the winter split, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. This is probably a top 2 or a top 1 team when they are at their best. They're just not consistent in terms of being at their best, which is what's caused them to fall into this spot in the first place. But when they play their own brand of League of Legends, especially with UG coming in and potentially upgrading the team, they're still one of the scariest teams in the world. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, and our final, qualification, elimination series, whatever you want to end up calling it. The final team to officially qualify for playoffs. It was 100 Thieves taking on Disguised, and predictably, 100 Thieves is going to be able to take this in a clean 2-0. I don't think there was going to be a lot of expectation for a back-and-forth series between these two teams. It was already a shock that 100 Thieves was not in the top 4. That's what happens when you get upset by Shopify and end up falling down into a spot that you don't need to be in. Shopify ends up taking this spot, but 100 Thieves rectify the problem. They get into playoffs. Unfortunately for them, they will be starting in the lower bracket. Remember, they're not going to get that extra life because they did not finish top 2 in their group, but being in there in the first place is already a positive. For Disguise, nobody expected this team to be able to compete for playoffs. They're the worst team in the LTA in terms of production, but it was somehow worse than maybe we even anticipated. They got blasted in this series. Between this and the FlyQuest Cloud9 series, we didn't really see a lot of back and forth across some series this week outside of Dig and LYON. So let's go ahead and talk about it. For 100 Thieves, player of the series for me is going to go to Quid. How can you give it to literally anyone else? What an absolute mid-canyon this series. I mean, the gap in the mid lane was so ginormous, I think I could drive through it. I mean, genuinely, there's just nothing else even really to say. Quid is so much better than Abbedagga on the other side that there was never going to be an opportunity for Abbedagga to stay even relevant in these games, and Quid very much abused that. I mean, the solo kill in Bottom River, I think, kind of said it all in terms of just the difference between these two players in skill level. But Quid, this is kind of a chance I would like to take to talk about his split. I don't think it's been as good as maybe some people are making it out to be. I'm the biggest Quid defender in the entire world. This is a guy who I've picked for MVP in the past, who I've called the best mid laner in North America, and I still do believe he is the best mid laner in North America. But again, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the production matches my individual evaluation of each player. The number 1 player in each role is not always going to be the player that I think is the all-pro from that split, especially in a format like this where it's such a small sample size. It just doesn't always happen like that. Quid has been pretty good, but there have been a couple of series that we haven't quite seen in the past couple of splits where things have been more up and down. For him individually as a player, he's not been able to carry as hard in a couple of unique situations, we'll just say, and so I don't want to sit here and tell you that Quid has been the best version of him that he's ever been. I thought he was better in winter, and I think he was better in summer of last year as well. That being said, he can turn it on at any point, and I still do believe he is the best mid laner in the region in terms of the talent and the consistency and the playstyle that he ends up having. I would take him over anybody else in North America, but it's not quite been as universally phenomenal as it has been in some splits in the past. Leave it to Abbedagga, though, to make things a bit easier for him to be able to get back into form going into playoffs. I want to give a big shout out to Sniper on the top side. Honestly, he's played pretty well across the spring split. I am kind of a known Sniper hater. Going back to last year, he was somebody that I criticized endlessly in the summer split. I was talking about him the way I talk about Impact right now, where it's this team is so good outside of Sniper, and he is the sole reason that they're not going to be able to compete for a championship. And that was kind of the case in 2024 for me. Maybe not the sole reason, but one of the bigger reasons. His playoff run, even with them making Worlds, was horrifically bad. He was awful at Worlds. He was bad in the regular season in summer. where everything was going wrong for him and I was out on him as a player. And that kind of carried over into the winter split once again, where things just weren't quite clicking for him. But I think spring has unlocked something a bit in his brain. It reminds me of that rookie split he had in spring of last year, where things were working a lot more successfully in the 1v1. He's starting to have that happen again. Again, it's really hard to get like a real read because he's going into Castle, who's been a nightmare over the course of spring, but Sniper's been playing much better. He gets his Riven here in game number 1. I'm sure he's pretty happy about that. I just think he's in better form now than people are giving him credit for, and I think he's a bigger part of why this team has found some success over the course of this split than people are giving him credit for. FBI and Ayla were obviously fantastic. FBI finally stepping up and being like somebody who can be a primary option. Once again, it's not been there in spring since, you know, that winter split. It hasn't really felt all that consistent, and Ayla was massively up on who he threw out a lot of pressure in this series. And then River was obviously really great. I'm not a fan of Trundle right now. I think that champion is super overplayed in pro, but at the end of the day, it ended up working because XU can't match that pressure. It's a nice win for 100 Thieves, but a very expected one. And for Disguised on the other side, like, what else even is there to say? Their split is now over. They're going to be moving into the summer split. You have to guess that they're going to be making changes because Abadaga cannot be starting here in the mid lane. And I know I just came off of saying like, oh, it's really difficult to imagine a world where one of the NACL teams would let their mid laner go, especially to Disguised. I think that that's doubly true for a team that, you know, could lose their spot to any of these NACL teams depending on what ends up happening. But if you've got to import somebody, if you've got to do anything, like there's got to be another option. There are teamless mid laners that I think would be upgrades over Abadaga right now. I don't know, man. Like there's got to be somebody out there that's going to be able to make a difference because this guy is completely unplayable at the tier 1 level, the worst player in the LTA, and it's not particularly close. He got blasted in this series, and there's just no reason for him to be rostered anymore, as rude as that sounds. But the rest of the team also didn't do well. Like Abadaga is going to take a lot of the criticism, but he was entirely useless on the Ashe in game number 2. The Caitlyn Ashe lane did not work out nearly the way they wanted to as the answer to Kalista. Ashe has generally been considered the answer to Kalista, but boy, this did not work at all for them. XU continues to be the worst jungler in the league. He just does not generate pressure on his own. His entire game plan and strategy revolves around his lanes being ahead, which they are not at the current moment. And Castle, as we've talked about in the past, has just completely mentally checked out. The form difference between what he was last year on Immortals and even in the winter split on Disguised versus what he is now is night and day. It's just a disaster for DSG. Right now, they are easily the worst team in the LTA, and they are a big threat to lose their spot in the LTA going into 2026, but they've got an entire split to be able to figure something out. They just need to do it now. If they can find an upgrade in the mid lane and then maybe in the jungle as well, I think you could potentially be looking at a team that could try to compete for top 5 or 6 because Scary Jerry has shown progression. If you can get Castle to lock in, I think the bot lane and top lane could theoretically be okay for this team. They're just not at the current moment, and a lot needs to be fixed in order to get there. But for 100 Thieves, they're in the playoffs now. Again, expending that extra life by not getting top 2 in their group is not ideal, but you're probably better than Shopify, who's in the upper bracket. You're certainly better than a team like Dignitas, depending on how the bracket ends up going. We could be looking at a situation where 100 Thieves are actually in an okay spot to get top 4 still, and that's probably still the goal for them. All right, but that is going to do it for my LTA North week number 7 overview and analysis video, and we are officially, finally done with the regular season here in the LTA. We're going to be moving in to playoffs, but a couple of things to close out the regular season. First and foremost, the player of the week and the dud of the week for week number 7. Typically, we would start with the standings, but no point in talking about power rankings or standings when we can talk about the bracket later on instead. Starting with player of the week, that for me is going to be going to Quid, the mid laner for 100 Thieves. He dominated Abadaga this week, and that's not the last week. We'll talk about that because Dud of the Week also kind of plays into that, but Quid was merciless in that matchup. You can see 12-0-10 on the Ahri, 9-0-10 on the Victor. We already talked about it, but he was an absolute monster in that series, and he decimated DSG's, hopes and dreams of trying to get into the playoffs and secured them for 100 Thieves. He might not have been as dominant across this split as he has in previous splits in terms of proportion, but the games that look good still look incredibly good. Honorable mentions for me for player of the week in this final week, Inspired for FlyQuest. Obviously, that team decimated Cloud9, and you can kind of, point a lot of fingers in a lot of different directions, but that's a big reason why Inspired ended up losing Player of the Week, is that it was more of a team effort than it was one individual player, but he was the best player on the team, so wanted to give him a shout out there. And then Shaden for Dignitas, some massive moments to come up big for a team that maybe didn't expect themselves to be in playoffs to actually get there. Shaden was a big turning point for that. So Shaden and Inspired are my honorable mentions, but my dud of the week is, of course, going to be going to Abadaga. There was nobody else that was even in conversation for this. Maybe Thanos Thanatos for Cloud9 because that team got obliterated so hard and I thought he was the worst on that team. But Abbedagga is so far and away the worst player in North America right now that to me it's only fitting that he goes out as the final dud of the week of the regular season. So Abbedagga is dud of the week, Quid is player of the week, and typically I would translate that into an outro or even the bracket, but let's close up on the regular season by ending with my all-pro team. I'm only doing one here for the LTA because the split was so shallow that it's really difficult to pull 3 all-pro teams out of that. I think one is a little bit more fitting, and as you can see up on your screen, it's already going to be pretty divisive in terms of the players that I picked. I want to give my criteria because people get mad about this in every video, and if you're already mad about it, please leave a comment. It's really good for the algorithm yelling at me about how stupid I am, but let's talk about my criteria. How many wins did you add to your team in the small sample size that was the regular season? This is not a list of the players that I think are the best in their role or even playing like the best in their role. I think it's specifically who has played the best in their role. Specifically, like over the course of these games, who was the most valuable? And people are going to disagree with this, and I'm going to give some other options that you could potentially give because, again, small sample size means some weird outcomes, but let's go ahead and talk about it. My all-pro team for the LTA North Spring split here is going to be in the top lane, Bwipo from FlyQuest, in the jungle, from Team Liquid. I'm sure that's already pissing people off. In the mid lane, Loki from Cloud9, in the bot lane, Sven from Cloud9, and in the support position, Busio from FlyQuest, and as you can see, Busio's also my pick for MVP, for most valuable player. We'll start with him. I know we typically go top to support here, but with Busio being my MVP pick, it kind of feels worth it to talk about him first. I really do think there's not been a player that's been more valuable in the LTA this split than what Busio has been for Fly. He's the primary playmaker, the primary facilitator for what that team wants to do. Not only are they the best team in the LTA, but they've been the most productive team in the LTA. Their only losses have been kind of out of nowhere. It's really just the Cloud9 series that ended up not going their way. I say series, the Cloud9 best of 1 that ended up not going their way, and outside of that, I think Busio has been utterly phenomenal. This is the best split of his entire career in terms of the production he's been on, and with no clear-cut, easy choice MVP, I don't really think there was anybody who ran away with that award. Busio, to me, kind of ends up taking it, even if it's not going to be the most popular opinion in the world. His teammate, Bwipo, is also going to be on the top side of the map. I should also throw out some honorable mentions. In the support position, this was not difficult for me. Busio was by far the most productive support in the entire league, but Vulcan, I think, definitely is up there in terms of what he was in the regular season. I think, obviously, Core is a very good player, but he was not in the conversation for me in terms of all-pro here. Bwipo, his teammate on the top side, also a pretty easy choice. I think, ironically enough, the only other player I was considering was Sniper for 100 Thieves, which is a very out-there pick that I don't think a lot of people are going to be going for, but Bwipo, I thought, was easily the best top laner in the league in terms of consistency, and it kind of shows that even if they brought in like a substitute top laner, they found no reason to ever play him because Bwipo has been that good so far on the top side. FlyQuest have been dominant. It only made sense to have 2 players from their team here. The big shocking one that people aren't going to like is going to be in the jungle because we just saw him get replaced, and that's a very funny conversation to have, and it's ironic because I'm giving my all-pro mention here in the jungle, but I do think the team got better once he was off of it. I think they're going from to Yuji in like a positive way, but again, just in terms of raw production, who's been valuable to Team Liquid this split, has won a lot of games for that team, a lot more than people are giving him credit for. There are multiple best of 1s, which, by the way, I am very much counting here, and then multiple best of 3s that I think he was super influential in winning, even if it doesn't necessarily show up on the stat sheet. If you wanted to put Inspired here, I have no major qualms with that. Inspired has been awesome across this split, and I think he definitely deserves an all-pro nod, but I'm going to stick to my guns, even if it's not very popular, and I'm going to put here because I think I might be the only person to do so. And then the Cloud9 boys coming in mid and AD carry. Loki has been maybe a bit more feast or famine than you would like, but still very valuable. He's added a ton of wins to Cloud9. A lot of the time at the beginning of the year when they were winning games, it was through Loki and through his ability to pressure out through the mid lane. Again, multiple other options here. Quid kind of reinserted himself into that after the win here against DSG, which, by the way, I did count these games because everybody got the equal amount of series, and so it didn't feel, off to count week 7 as an actual regular season week. But of course, the other big one that I considered was APA, and I think you could absolutely put APA here, and it would make a lot of sense if you wanted to put APA mid and then Inspired jungle. I certainly have no issue, and I can understand going in that direction, but I thought Loki, even if he had more bad games than APA did, had more good games than APA did, and so I'm going to give it to Loki. And then Sven, AD carry was not a particularly prominent role in the spring split. I don't actually think there was any AD carry that stood out, consistently across the entire split, so Sven ends up getting it just kind of as a consolation prize. He was the most consistent AD carry, even if his highs weren't exactly the highest in the world. I think Masu was, in the running for this, and again, every FlyQuest member played particularly well. There really weren't a lot of other players outside of that I think you could have considered, but Sven was at the very least in the conversation for most consistent player in the league, and so he's going to get the All-Pro nod there. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with. I'm sure you disagree with a lot, and again, the comments help the algorithm, so please leave them down in the comment section below. But now that we've wrapped up the regular season, let's go ahead and jump into the bracket. This is what it's going to look like. Of course, the top 4 teams that played for seeding this week are automatically slotted into the upper bracket. FlyQuest beating Cloud9 gets the number 1 seed, and of course, Team Liquid beating Shopify gets the number 3 seed, and so it ends up breaking down like Fly versus Shopify in round 1 and Cloud9 versus Team Liquid. These are some very, very fun matchups. Fly should decimate Shopify. I don't think anybody's considering that series close. That's why the number 1 seed was a pretty big deal, because whoever gets to play Shopify in round 1 basically gets a bye into winners finals, which is pretty nice, all things considered. But Cloud9 Team Liquid is going to tell us a whole ton about where these teams stand. I think with Spawn back and generally with potentially Yuji upgrading this team, Team Liquid could be considered favorites going into this, especially because Cloud9 got obliterated by Fly, but C9 have been better across this split so far. You know, I'm going to tentatively lean in favor of Team Liquid. I'm going to say 3-2 Team Liquid because we are moving into best of 5s now. That would be my prediction. And 3-0 in favor of Fly. I think they will decimate Shopify. But that brings us down to Dignitas and 100 Thieves on the lower end of the bracket. Of course, they end up playing the losers from round number 1. I'm not sure if, side selection has already been determined, if Dig is playing the loser of Fly Shopify, and if 100 Thieves is playing the loser of Cloud9 TL, because that's how it looks here. If it is reseeded based off of seeding, that makes a lot more sense. 100 Thieves would be able to play Shopify and probably beat them, and Dig would probably lose to whoever lost between Cloud9 and Team Liquid. If it's the other way around, if 100 Thieves have to play one of Cloud9 or Team Liquid, and one of those, 3 teams is going to be out within the first 2 teams in the playoffs, that's going to be crazy. Like, it would be a very weird setup. Shopify versus Dig to get into lower bracket round number 2 would also be very funny, but my predictions, of course, 100 Thieves still a top 4 team. They should be able to handle Shopify if they're down there, and Dig, while they look good, definitely not good enough to beat one of Cloud9 or Team Liquid if it does go that way. So let me know what you agree with or disagree with in terms of those predictions as well down in the comment section below, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're gonna be posting about every single game in the LTA playoffs, as we're doing for all 3 of the other major regions as well. So LEC, LCK, and LPL, especially when they start kicking off. We also covered the playoffs here in the NACL. We posted our round 1 and round 2 video for the upper bracket yesterday. You can check that out on the channel as well. But if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all